When we hear the name Caligula, we think of madness, depravity, and an emperor who supposedly wanted to make his horse a consul. But to truly understand Caligula's story, we need to rewind the clock a bit. We need to look at the man who ruled Rome before him, the Emperor Tiberius. Because the Rome that Caligula inherited wasn't a golden city full of happy citizens. It was a place scarred by paranoia, fear, and a deep-seated distrust of the person sitting on the imperial throne. Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, was the stepson of the great Augustus. He was a brilliant general, a man who had secured Rome's frontiers and won decisive victories. In his early years, he was seen as a capable, if somewhat grim and reserved successor. But the weight of power, combined with a series of personal tragedies, began to change him. His son and chosen heir, Drusus, died suddenly, likely poisoned. This event shattered Tiberius, and from that point on, a dark cloud seemed to hang over his reign. The real turning point came with the rise of a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the ambitious and ruthless head of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards. As Tiberius grew more reclusive and suspicious of the Senate, he began to rely heavily on Sejanus. He saw him as a loyal partner, someone who could handle the dirty work of politics in Rome while Tiberius could retreat from the public eye. This was a catastrophic mistake. Tiberius eventually withdrew from Rome altogether, moving to the island of Capri. He said he was tired of the political games and the constant backstabbing in the capital. But by leaving, he created a power vacuum, and Sejanus was more than happy to fill it. From his island villa, Tiberius communicated his orders, but it was Sejanus who was the face of imperial power in Rome. He controlled access to the emperor, filtered information, and began to systematically eliminate his rivals. Under Sejanus's influence, the infamous treason trials began in earnest. The law of maiestas, or treason, was originally meant to protect the state, but now it was twisted into a weapon. Anyone could be accused of disrespecting the emperor. A misplaced word, a joke that fell flat, or simply being wealthy and influential was enough to bring a charge of treason. The trials were a farce. The accused had little hope of a fair hearing. The punishment was often execution, with the state seizing all their property. This created a reign of terror among the Roman elite. Senators lived in constant fear, never knowing who would be accused next. Friendships dissolved as people became afraid to associate with anyone who might fall out of favor. Informers, known as delatores, thrived. They were rewarded with a share of the condemned person's property, creating a vicious incentive to invent accusations out of thin air. Rome became a city of whispers and paranoia. The very fabric of its high society was being torn apart by suspicion and greed, all orchestrated by Sejanus with the emperor's distant approval. While all this was happening in Rome, what was Tiberius doing on Capri? The stories that came back were scandalous. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius paint a picture of an old man indulging in every kind of debauchery, far from the prying eyes of the Senate. While these accounts might be exaggerated, they reflected the growing disgust and fear the people of Rome felt towards their absent emperor. He was no longer the stoic general. He was a remote and terrifying figure, ruling through his brutal enforcer. The downfall of Sejanus was as dramatic as his rise. Eventually, Tiberius received a warning from his sister-in-law Antonia, detailing Sejanus's plot to seize the throne for himself. The emperor, a master of deception when he chose to be, acted carefully. He sent a secret letter to the Senate, a long and rambling message that kept everyone in suspense. Only at the very end did it command the arrest of Sejanus. The senators, who had been fawning over Sejanus moments before, instantly turned on him. He was dragged to prison and executed, his body torn apart by the mob. But the fall of Sejanus didn't end the terror. In fact, it got worse. Tiberius, now consumed by paranoia and realizing how deeply he had been betrayed, lashed out. He unleashed a new wave of executions, targeting anyone and everyone who had ever been associated with Sejanus. The prisons overflowed, and the Tiber River was said to be choked with bodies. The last years of Tiberius's reign were a bloodbath, a grim finale to a rule that had started with so much promise. And this is the Rome that awaited the young Caligula. Imagine being a young man, growing up in this toxic environment. Caligula's own family had been destroyed by this political climate. His mother and two older brothers were arrested and exiled, eventually dying from starvation or execution. all victims of the paranoia that festered under Tiberius. Caligula himself only survived because he was young and learned to hide his true feelings. Playing the part of a sycophantic courtier to the aging emperor on Capri, he lived every day knowing that one wrong step could mean his death. So when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the people of Rome rejoiced. They poured into the streets, celebrating the end of a long and oppressive nightmare. They saw Caligula not as the monster he would become in historical memory, but as a breath of fresh air. He was the son of the beloved general Germanicus, a handsome, charismatic young man who represented a complete break from the grim, bloody past. Initially, Caligula seemed to be everything the people hoped for. He put a stop to the treason trials, pardoned exiles, and paid out the generous bonuses left in Tiberius's will. He hosted lavish games and public spectacles. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief. It seemed like the dark days were finally over. The paranoia was gone, replaced by hope and celebration. But the damage had already been done. The system of absolute power, unchecked by law or tradition, had been solidified under Tiberius. The Senate had been cowed into submission. The people had become accustomed to the idea of an emperor who held the power of life and death over everyone. Tiberius had shown just how dark the Principate could become. He had poisoned the well, and the young man who had survived that poison, who had watched his family be destroyed and had lived in constant fear, was now the most powerful person in the world. The psychological scars from his youth under Tiberius ran deep. Caligula had learned his lessons not from the noble Augustus, but from the paranoid and cruel Tiberius. He had learned that power was absolute, that loyalty was fleeting, and that fear was the most effective tool of governance. So, when Caligula's own reign took a turn towards tyranny, was it just madness? Or was he, in some ways, a product of his time, a monster created by the monster who came before him? The reign of Tiberius set the stage. It created the conditions that terrified elite, a powerful Praetorian Guard, and a populace desperate for a savior that allowed Caligula's excesses to happen. Before you can judge Caligula, you have to understand the Rome he inherited. A city recovering from a long sickness, whose cure, they soon discovered, was far worse than the disease. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into Rome's darker side interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think about the link between Tiberius and Caligula. See you next time. Imagine a city, the center of the known world, teetering on the brink of collapse. The year is 284 AD. The Roman Empire, once a symbol of unshakable power, is crumbling. For 50 years, it has been torn apart by civil war, plagued by barbarian invasions, and crippled by economic ruin. This was the crisis of the 3rd century. The people of Rome were exhausted. Every day was a struggle for survival. Farmers couldn't protect their crops, merchants couldn't travel safely, and the silver in their coins was nearly gone, replaced by worthless copper. The glorious eagle of the legions was battered and bruised. Hope was a distant memory. The people of Rome, from the sun-drenched fields of Hispania to the misty forests of Gaul, desperately craved a new beginning. They yearned for a leader strong enough to calm the storm. And then he arrived, a man not of noble birth, but forged in the crucible of the military. His name was Diocles. Born in Dalmatia, what we now call Croatia, he rose through the army ranks on pure merit. He was a brilliant cavalry commander, a shrewd strategist, and possessed a will of iron. In 284 AD, after the mysterious death of the emperor, the army gathered and proclaimed him Emperor. Little did they know, this soldier emperor would not just be another fleeting figure in a chaotic century. He was about to fundamentally reshape the Roman world, pulling it back from the abyss and laying the groundwork for the next 1,000 years of history. Diocletian looked at the vast, unwieldy empire and saw the core of the problem. It was simply too big for one person to govern effectively. News of a revolt in Britain or an invasion on the Danube could take weeks to reach Rome, by which time it was often too late. So, he made a revolutionary decision. He wasn't going to hoard power. He was going to share it. In 286 AD, he appointed a trusted military colleague, Maximian, as his co-emperor. Diocletian would rule the wealthier, more stable eastern half of the empire from his new capital in Nicomedia, while Maximian would take charge of the turbulent western half, including Rome itself. This was the birth of the diarchy, the rule of two. For the first time, there were two Augusti, two emperors, working in concert to defend and administer the realm. The empire had two heads, but one mind. But Diocletian didn't stop there. He knew that the biggest source of instability was succession. For decades, emperors had been made and unmade by their armies. The moment an emperor died, a bloody civil war would erupt as generals vied for the throne. To solve this, Diocletian expanded his system. In 293 AD, he created the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. He and Maximian each adopted a junior emperor, a Caesar, who would serve as their second-in-command and designated heir. Galerius was appointed as Caesar to Diocletian in the east, and Constantius was appointed to Maximian in the west. Each of the four rulers was given a specific territory to govern and defend. It was a brilliant political innovation. The empire was now divided into four manageable prefectures, each with a leader on the ground, ready to respond to threats instantly. It created a clear line of succession, theoretically ending the cycle of civil war. With the political structure stabilized, Diocletian turned his attention to the economy. Decades of debasing the currency had led to rampant, uncontrollable inflation. People's life savings could become worthless overnight. To combat this, Diocletian initiated a complete overhaul of the Roman tax system. He conducted a massive, empire-wide census, recording land, livestock, and people. Taxes were no longer based on easily devalued money, but on units of land and labor, paid in kind with grain, oil, and other goods. It was a harsh system, often locking people into their professions and tying farmers to their land. Bought it, work it. It provided a steady, predictable stream of supplies for the army and the bureaucracy, stabilizing the state's finances. Then, in 301 AD, he took an even more drastic step. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. This law set fixed legal prices for thousands of goods and services, from wheat and beef to haircuts and shipping fees. The penalty for overcharging was death. While the edict was ultimately unenforceable and largely failed, it shows the sheer determination of Diocletian to impose order on the economic chaos. The military also underwent a massive transformation. Diocletian understood that the old model of legions stationed on the frontiers was no longer enough. The empire was being attacked from all sides. He implemented a new strategy. Defense in depth. He dramatically increased the size of the army, possibly doubling it to over 500,000 men. He strengthened border fortifications, creating a layered defense of forts and watchtowers. But his key innovation was the creation of a large, mobile field army. These elite units were not tied to the frontier but were stationed in strategic locations further inland. When a barbarian force broke through the border, this mobile army could be rapidly dispatched to intercept and destroy them. The frontier garrisons would slow the enemy down, and the field army would deliver the knockout blow. This system gave the empire the flexibility it needed to counter multiple threats simultaneously. Diocletian's reforms were about one thing: control. He sought to impose order on every aspect of Roman life. This extended to the emperor's image itself. Gone were the days of the princeps, the first citizen among equals. Diocletian adopted the trappings of an Eastern monarch. He became Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Anyone granted an audience had to perform proskynesis, prostrating themselves fully on the ground before him. He wore a diamond diadem, purple silk robes, and shoes studded with precious gems. This wasn't just about vanity. It was a calculated political move to elevate the emperor far above any potential rival, to make him a sacred, untouchable figure, and break the cycle of military assassinations. He was no longer just a general. He was the divine choice to rule. However, this demand for total control had a dark side. In an empire where the emperor was officially a god, any group that refused to acknowledge his divinity was seen as a threat to the state's unity and the emperor's authority. This put the growing Christian community on a collision course with the imperial government. Christians refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods and the emperor's image, declaring their allegiance was to one god alone. In 303 AD, encouraged by his Caesar, Diocletian unleashed the final and most severe persecution of Christians in Roman history. The Great Persecution saw churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and clergy arrested. Christians were stripped of their legal rights, and in some parts of the empire, particularly the East, they faced torture and execution for refusing to recant their faith. It was a brutal attempt to enforce religious uniformity, a final, desperate effort to stamp out a belief system seen as fundamentally disloyal to the new order. Then, in 305 AD, Diocletian did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He voluntarily abdicated. At a grand ceremony, and his co-emperor, Maximian, stepped down, allowing their Caesars, Galerius, and Constantine to rise to the rank of Augustus, just as the system intended. Diocletian retired to a massive, fortress-like palace he had built in his homeland of Dalmatia, in modern-day Split, Croatia. He spent his final years famously tending to his vegetable garden. When he was later begged to return to power to solve a new political crisis, he simply replied that, if they could see the cabbages he had grown, with his own hands, they would never suggest he trade such peace and happiness for the storms of power. His system, the Tetrarchy, had worked. For a moment, sadly, the perfect machine Diocletian had built couldn't account for human ambition. After he retired, the system quickly fell apart. The new emperors jockeyed for power, and civil war erupted once more. A war that would ultimately see Constantine the Great, the son of Constantius, rise to become the sole ruler of the Roman world. So, was Diocletian a failure? Not at all. Although his tetrarchy didn't last, his other reforms did. The division of the empire into east and west would become permanent, leading to the creation of the Byzantine Empire, which would survive for another 1,000 years. His administrative, tax, and military reforms provided the very framework for that survival. He stabilized a dying empire and gave it a new lease on life for another 2 centuries in the West. He was the great reformer, the restorer of the world. He found an empire made of brick and left it made of marble ore, perhaps more accurately. He found a ship sinking in a hurricane, and through sheer force of will, he patched the holes, manned the pumps, and steered it back into calmer waters. The people of Rome had wanted hope and a new beginning, and in the iron-willed soldier from Dalmatia, found Italiano. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey back to the age of Diocletian, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from the annals of history. See you next time. Have you ever heard of a leader who was so beloved, so full of promise, that an entire empire breathed a sigh of relief when he took power? Now, what if I told you that in just a few months, this same man would become one of history's most infamous tyrants? This isn't fiction. This is the chilling, true story of Caligula, the Roman emperor whose reign began with hope and ended in madness. Let's rewind to the year 37 AD. The Roman Empire is holding its breath. The previous emperor, Tiberius, was old, paranoid, and deeply unpopular. His reign ended in a cloud of fear and suspicion. So when his young grandnephew, Gaius Caesar, nicknamed Caligula, which means little boot, took the throne, it felt like a new dawn. Rome erupted in celebration. The people adored him. He was young, charismatic, and came from a legendary family. His father was the beloved General Germanicus, a true hero of the people. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman respected for her strength and virtue. Caligula was, in every sense, Roman royalty. And for the first 7 months, he was everything Rome had hoped for. He was a breath of fresh air. He granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, securing their loyalty. He destroyed Tiberius's treason papers, effectively pardoning those who had been living in fear of prosecution. He recalled exiles, hosted lavish public games and chariot races, and abolished unpopular taxes. The people chanted his name in the streets. They called him their star and their baby. The Senate, eager to please this popular new ruler, showered him with honors. It seemed like a golden age was just beginning. Caligula was not just an emperor. He was a savior. But then, everything changed. In October of 37 AD, just a few months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. The entire empire was plunged into despair. People gathered in the streets, praying for his recovery. Some even offered their own lives to the gods in exchange for his. The exact nature of his illness is still debated by historians. Some ancient sources, like Suetonius, describe it as a brain fever. Modern scholars have proposed everything from epilepsy to encephalitis, which is an inflammation of the brain. Others speculate it might have been a severe nervous breakdown, brought on by the immense pressure of ruling the world's greatest empire. Whatever it was, when Caligula finally recovered, he was a different man. The charming, generous, and level-headed youth was gone. In his place stood a monster, a man who was suspicious, cruel, unpredictable, and consumed by an insatiable hunger for absolute power. The change was so drastic, so complete, that it was as if a different soul had taken over his body. The man who emerged from that sickbed would leave a scar on Roman history that has never faded. The first signs of this dark transformation were subtle, then they became terrifyingly obvious. Caligula grew increasingly paranoid. He started to see conspiracies everywhere, enemies in every shadow. He had his own cousin and father-in-law executed on flimsy charges of treason. Friends who had celebrated his rise to power now feared for their lives. He turned on the very Senate that had supported him, humiliating them in public and treating them like his personal servants. He would make them run 4 miles beside his chariot, or force them to stand in attendance while he ate. But his cruelty wasn't just political. It was personal and deeply sadistic. He took pleasure in other people's suffering. He would have people tortured and executed at his dinner parties, considering it a form of entertainment. He famously complained that his reign was too peaceful, lamenting that it wouldn't be remembered for any great disasters like a military defeat or a famine. He seemed to crave chaos and fear. The whispers in the street grew louder. The people who had once called him their star now called him a monster. And then came the ultimate act of hubris. Caligula began to believe he wasn't just a man anymore. He was a god. This wasn't just a political title, like previous emperors had taken after their deaths. Caligula believed he was a living, breathing deity walking among mortals. He started demanding that people worship him directly. He built temples dedicated to himself, and even set up a priesthood in his own honor. He would dress up as various gods, Jupiter, Neptune, even the goddess Venus, and hold conversations with their statues. He even went so far as to replace the heads of famous statues of gods with his own likeness. This was a shocking and profound break from Roman tradition. While emperors were often deified after death, claiming divinity while alive was seen as an act of pure madness. It alienated him from everyone: the Senate, the military, and the people. Rome was a society built on tradition and respect for the gods. And here was their emperor, not only disrespecting the gods but claiming to be one of them. His personal life became just as bizarre and depraved as his public one. He was accused of having incestuous relationships with his sisters, especially his favorite, Drusilla. After she died, he had her deified, making her a goddess, and enforced a period of public mourning so strict that laughing or bathing was punishable by death. He would seize the wives of prominent senators, sleep with them, and then return them to their husbands, often critiquing their performance in bed in front of everyone at dinner parties. His palace became a den of debauchery and excess, funded by extorting money from the wealthy citizens of Rome. He would accuse them of fake crimes, confiscate their property, and add it to his own treasury to pay for his lavish lifestyle. Perhaps the most famous story illustrating his contempt for the Roman establishment is the one about his horse, Incitatus. Caligula adored this horse. He gave it a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and even a house with furniture and servants to entertain its guests. But the ultimate insult came when he announced his intention to make the horse a consul, one of the 2 highest elected officials in Rome. Historians debate whether he was serious or if it was a twisted joke, a way to show the senators that his horse was more worthy of high office than any of them. Either way, the message was clear. Caligula held the entire political system of Rome in utter contempt. He could do whatever he wanted, no matter how absurd, and no one could stop him. He also had grand, and frankly, bizarre, military ambitions. He once marched his legions to the northern coast of Gaul, modern-day France, supposedly to invade Britain. But once they reached the English Channel, he ordered his soldiers not to cross the water. Instead, he commanded them to collect seashells from the beach, declaring them the spoils of the ocean, a tribute won from the god Neptune. He then marched his army back to Rome to celebrate a grand triumph over the sea itself. It was a spectacle of pure madness, a massive waste of resources that left his generals and soldiers utterly baffled and humiliated. At this point, Rome was living under a reign of terror. No one was safe. Caligula's whims could mean life or death. The empire that had celebrated his arrival was now trapped in a nightmare of its own making. The Senate was powerless, the people were terrified, and the military was growing restless. How could this have happened? How could the promising young man turn into this deranged tyrant? Was it the illness? Did it physically damage his brain? Or did the absolute, unchecked power of being a Roman emperor corrupt him completely? Perhaps it was a combination of both, a pre-existing instability that was unleashed by the illness and amplified by absolute authority. The truth is, we will never know for sure. But what we do know is that his reign couldn't last. The fear he inspired eventually turned into hatred. The very people tasked with protecting him began to plot against him. The Praetorian Guard, the same men he had won over with bonuses at the start of his reign, were the ones who would ultimately bring him down. Led by their prefect, Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula had repeatedly mocked and insulted. They decided that the monster had to be destroyed. In January of 41 AD, after less than 4 years on the throne, the end came. As Caligula was walking through a private corridor in his palace, the conspirators ambushed him. They stabbed him over and over again, a brutal and violent end for a brutal and violent ruler. To ensure his dynasty would not continue, they also murdered his wife and his infant daughter. The reign of Caligula serves as a terrifying cautionary tale. It's a story about how quickly things can fall apart, how fragile sanity can be, and how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. He started as a symbol of hope and became a symbol of tyranny. His name, once chanted with love, is now synonymous with cruelty, madness, and excess. It reminds us that behind the grand titles and stone monuments of history, there are real, flawed, and sometimes deeply disturbed human beings. The story of Caligula is not just a chapter in the history of ancient Rome. It's a timeless warning about the darkness that can lie within the human heart, especially when given a crown. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you won't forget. Let me know in the comments what you think was Caligula, mad, or just evil. See you in the next video.